I'm Drake. I'm from the Steel Yard. And in some ways, I think our stories are going to be a little bit different. I've actually known Holly for quite some time. And there's, I think, an intentional pairing today because of our history together. And when we met to talk about this session, part of the conversation between us was art practice. And Holly alluded at the end of her presentation about the procession and the work she's done with the pond, that she's been worried about her practice. And we really got into that pretty heavily. And I think maybe in the question session, we'll be able to do that. I think what's interesting about that for me as I think about what she presented today is that I'm sort of the imposter now because I no longer make art. I did once make art. And what I have seen is that in the course of becoming an administrator, which is kind of an odd word, but it's what we kind of are, and you might be becoming, we don't know. That I think, and Barnaby in the room, I think you can speak to that also. I think there are changes that happen to our practice, and then there's that fatal moment when someone says, "Oh, but your work is your art. This place is your art. This project." So what I'm going to talk about today is the thing that I've become, which is a place and an organization. But also what I kind of want to play with a little bit in that conversation is that the Steel Yard began as this very kind of crazy, disorganized place, really a destination for people to go make things, and then it became an organization. And I think some of the struggles that we've had around that is that once you decide to become that, you have to figure out how to still be the artist, right? So an organization can go through that too, I think. And what has happened for the Steel Yard, and we'll talk about this a little bit, is as many of you who are here in Rhode Island have undoubtedly heard, we've done a huge environmental cleanup. And very much like Holly's been talking about, there were a lot of things that couldn't happen until that cleanup happened. And so when we began the project, I think for us, it was just going to be this step that we were going to take. Right? We have to clean this up. There's a lead issue. We're going to clean it up, and we're going to get back to what we want to do. We're going to go back to making our art. Well, I've been at the Steel Yard for 6 years, and that was what I was hired to do. We finished it about 1 year ago. We have been receiving awards. We've been written about. There are countless things being drafted about us for next year, and all of it is about the cleanup. Now, we didn't clean up the place to be famous for that, and I'm excited about it because it was a lot of work, but I'm really intrigued sort of intellectually by watching the environmental cleanup have a life of its own. But our artistic practice, we have to keep trying to remind people we do things here. We're training people, we're trying to create a local market for small-scale manufacturing. We are trying to engage in the community. And it's almost as if the environmental project has taken over and kind of has a life of its own. So I'm going to sort of playfully talk about that because it is such a big part of what we're doing, but in the process also try to talk about the organization and why we did the project the way we did. And I was very caught with what Holly said about these signs that say you can't, and I'm really aware that in the work that we've done environmentally in the neighborhood we're in, that there were so many can'ts when we started that people didn't want to invest there. Sort of moving forward to today, we're in a completely transformed neighborhood. And I think I wouldn't have anticipated that impact in quite the way that it has happened. And yet, if I look at the mission of the Steel Yard, which is to create economic revitalization through creative means, we did it. It just wasn't the way that we imagined it would happen. And I think what has been a great lesson to me, not only at the Steel Yard, but in other projects I have done, all of which have been really very community-based, and when I was more of a working artist, I think even more so, is that you don't really have a lot of control. And I think there's something really wonderful about that, that you can do a certain amount of planning, and you should, absolutely. But I also think there's kind of a beauty to how, if you really surrender to what you're learning, it does take on a life of its own. So last night, to kind of bring this full circle, I was at the State House receiving a preservation award for historic landscape. It's the first one that's been awarded in Rhode Island on industrial landscape. And what we were told by the committee was, we've never thought about industrial landscapes and brownfields as worthy of a landscape award. So you've made us rethink that. So we didn't plan to have an effect on local preservation, never thought about it, but here we are. So I think that's a little bit of surrendering. So the Steelyard story is really that it was at the heart of the Industrial Valley, which is part of, again, all of our sort of water systems here, but the Muskatucket River kind of comes down the valley, flows right into the center of town. Your water fire happens there, so I think about that as it kind of ends up dumping right into that area. It's a tidal river. It was and remains contaminated, but it is, of course, with the help of many organizations, including the Watershed Council that stewards the river, one of our tenants at the Steelyard, coming back, and you're seeing the wildlife and the sort of indigenous species of all kinds there. But the Steelyard, like many of its fellow brownfield sites along the river, really was a production facility fabricating large-scale beams for skyscrapers, as well as ornamental fences, and really a competitive business that was working internationally. Its biggest competitor was in Hamilton, Ontario. So for 100 years, from about the turn of the 20th century until the early part of this century, this was a huge business. And then one day, it just couldn't anymore. Now, when I came to the Steelyard 6 years ago, the story was China. China made it fail. And that sounded reasonable. We've heard that about the industry in the US, the steel industry in particular. So that sounded fine. But as I spent more time talking to people who worked there and the family who owned it last, etc., what I learned was it was a bigger story about what we've done to the idea of working with our hands, what it means to be in labor or trades. And so, sorry about that. And so we started to think about what that story meant and what it meant to how we changed sort of what we were doing programmatically and kind of adapted to that, but also what it meant to the site. And that's sort of a locator of where we are. You can sort of see we're very close to downtown, but we are in our own little area, and that sort of green space that's designated up there is really showing you along the river. And then if you look in the little sort of circle that's looking towards the State House spire is right there. So we're quite sort of in the center of that urban area. So getting that story from people about, well, you know, it was more about the families. Children didn't really like working in the factory. They didn't want to meet anybody. They didn't know anything about the industry. I started to realize that it wasn't just like, oh, it failed and everything went overseas, but it was more about scale. Something in the scale of it, something about how people were learning, something about how families were passing on traditions. And on a more national level, how we treat ideas around trade and working with your hands, which of course is industrial arts for all of us in the room. So we started thinking a lot about that, and when we started to work on the design of this project, what became really important, and just to review quickly, we had lead in the soil from painting of large beams. They just sprayed them, and it went everywhere, and it embedded into the soil. That being said, if we weren't in Rhode Island, we wouldn't have had to do the cleanup at all. So if we were in Massachusetts or Connecticut, we would have spent $1.2 million on this site cleaning up. Now, again, there's a blessing in this, because having to take on the level of research that we did to do the project, stakeholder meetings, conversations about what the most important things we could do programmatically to the site. Because imagine that you're a young organization and someone says, you have to make all the decisions right now for what this is going to be about. How are you going to teach? How are you going to be part of the community? Make the decision today, because once you cap it, you don't get to go back underneath without a lot of activity and a lot of intense expense. So a big part of this was talking to people and saying, what matters to you? What do you love about this place? Talking to people who had been in the metals industry and saying, what scale could work here? And how can we integrate our interest in the arts with economic revitalization, which we've said is what we want to be doing, but we didn't really know what that meant exactly. So in those conversations, we learned that this space, which is sort of, these are panoramas of the steel yard as it was, and some of you I'm sure saw it like this, that this kind of craziness, the wildness of it, was something people did not want to lose. Please don't take that away. And importantly, the gantries that you see running across the site, which represent the work that was done there, don't let that go. We also went on the historic register, and we wanted to do that in order to force some of that language to stay for the future. So in some ways, it limits us, and there are aspects of that we don't like, but at the same time, it made a statement to the future about, we will always be about this, and we're not going to stop. Just not going to leave our story. So this is again the steel yard in the past, and you can see it was a working yard, lots of trucks, lots of stuff hanging around, and this is the steel yard in its projection, what was planned for it. And this number 4 in the center, there's a big green space. That was one of the aspects that we wanted to plan into the project, because we felt that we wanted a gathering space. We wanted there to be opportunity for people to play music, make art, do shows, and also for our own events that we hold at the steel yard. So that was a very intentional introduction into the space, sort of the idea of a park in the middle of the west side. These are just some of the ways that the architects thought about, from a design perspective, working with different layers of the site. This was again out of the stakeholder meetings that we had. This idea of paving, the carpet, number 1. Number 2, the moat. The site is 100% reduction in stormwater. We've achieved that, and that has been done through passive rain gardens that circulate the site, all of those green spaces, as well as through the landforms, which gather the rain. And finally, the materials we've used, which are all kinds of different pavings. Many of them are pervious or open enough to allow the rain to go right into the site rather than run out to the river, which it used to do. This is the steel yard today. You can see that it's a very different space and a much more, I think, welcoming environment. For anyone who's been to events there in the last year, you've probably sat on that hill, you've probably observed events. I'm going to skip that. You've probably seen some of these interventions that are really recycled materials that we had donated in order to not take away from the feeling of the site. And these are some of the other spaces, a movie room, and an outdoor gathering space for music. And this is actually what the architects call the spontaneous living room. I would call actually the spaces for studios. We're going to have 10 studios up there out of shipping containers. And again, some of the detail. So going back to where we started, this is kind of where we are. Everybody wants to talk about the project, and we are excited about that, but we're also a little distracted by it. This is what we want to be about. So we want to be having our events on the site. We want people to come there and hang out. These are 2 of our well-known events, Iron Chef and the Iron Pour, coming up at the end of this month. Cruise night, which is every summer, and movie nights, which happen on Thursdays in the summer. And then, of course, what we really want to do is the learning, training, and making. So today, the Steel Yard engages with folks from 13 to whenever. I think our oldest student has been 78 to date. And we do that for open enrollment classes in industrial arts, welding, blacksmithing, ceramics, glass casting, and fusing, and also workforce training for 18 to 24-year-olds. Again, out of this history that we inherited, the workforce training became what we realized we were best at. So what we started to do there is take the artistic side of what we do, which is these really unique garbage cans and bike racks and tree guards that you'll see all over Providence and increasingly across the region, and engage people to learn how to make those, then have them make them working for us, and then install them in the community. This creates a couple of different processes. One, you've got people who are now stewarding their community in a different way because they built it. One of the signs of success that we have is actually that our stuff doesn't get tagged. Now, that may seem odd, and believe me, funders aren't interested in that at all. They never want to hear that. But we notice that our things don't get tagged. And in our particular communities that we serve, that's actually a pretty significant statement. So although it's sort of an awkward way to say it, I think that cleaning up the site and kind of having to go through the process of doing that and kind of looking at the environmental issues that face the community and the sort of justice issues that come out of that caused us to rethink some of what we were doing, which from the perspective of our founders was, let's just get people together and make art, you know, and let's just do that and it'll be great. And we have sort of formalized that, I think, more around the site. This is our Iron Core event, which is at the end of this month. I encourage you all to come. Last year it had 1,200 people, and prior to the cleanup, we could have never imagined that number of people at the site, so it made a huge difference. But to just sort of, I guess, tie back to the organization, on kind of what we've come to, I think what we found is the obligations we've had have been very distracting from the work we want to do. And I think that there's a cautionary tale in all that, you know, working at that intersection between sort of art making and community change, sometimes you get a little bit waylaid, and I think we have felt fairly waylaid by that. And it has built its own responsibility. I mean, we are constantly being asked to go to conferences and talk about the cleanup. We are asked to give tours to every conference that comes to town that's about urban design. And they're the only press outlets that tend to call us are about the project. So a challenge for us now is to really get past that. We're incredibly proud of this project. It had to happen. We did it with lots of room for growth in the future. But the question is, was it the appropriate focus for an arts organization? Some level we think it was, because it's changed sort of how we focus on training and teaching. But had we not had to do it, I think the conversation would be very different today. The studio would be a very different place. So those are my thoughts about the art.